Welcome to Noctis Inkborne, a sanctuary for profound literature, timeless philosophy, and the great thinkers who shaped human history. If you seek knowledge, reflection, and the quiet power of classic works, you're in the right place. Today, we continue our journey with Part 2 of Discourses on Livy, written by the master political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. In this part, Machiavelli digs even deeper into the foundations of republics, the nature of political stability, and the forces that shape the rise and fall of nations. His insights remain as sharp and relevant today as they were in the 16th century. Settle in, breathe, and let your mind open as we step once again into the world of Roman history and political wisdom. This is Discourses on Livy, Part 2, narrated for you by Noctis Inkborne. Let the discourse continue.
Chapter 28. Whence it came that the Romans were less ungrateful to their citizens than were the Athenians. In the histories of all republics, we meet with instances of some sort of ingratitude to their great citizens, but fewer in the history of Rome than of Athens, or indeed of any other republic. Searching for the cause of this, I am persuaded that, so far as regards Rome and Athens, it was due to the Romans having had less occasion than the Athenians to look upon their fellow citizens with suspicion. For from the expulsion of her kings down to the times of Sylla and Marius, the liberty of Rome was never subverted by any one of her citizens, so that there never was in that city grave cause for distrusting any man, and in consequence making him the victim of inconsiderate injustice. The reverse was notoriously the case with Athens, for that city, having, at a time when she was most flourishing, been deprived of her freedom by Pisistratus, under a false show of goodwill, remembering, after she regained her liberty, her former bondage and all the wrongs she had endured, became the relentless chastiser not only of offenses on the part of her citizens, but even of the shadow of an offense. Hence the banishment and death of so many excellent men, and hence the law of ostracism, and all those other violent measures which, from time to time during the history of that city, were directed against her foremost citizens. For this is most true, which is asserted by the writers on civil government, that a people which has recovered its freedom bites fiercely than one which has always preserved it. And any who shall weigh well what has been said in this matter will not condemn Athens, nor commend Rome, but refer all to the necessity arising out of the different conditions prevailing in the two states. For careful reflection will show that had Rome been deprived of her freedom as Athens was, she would not have been a whit more tender to her citizens. This we may reasonably infer from remarking what after the expulsion of the kings befell Collatinus and Publius Valerio, the former of whom, though he had taken part in the liberation of Rome, was sent into exile for no other reason than he bore the name of Tarquin, while the sole ground of suspicion against the latter, and what almost led to his exile, was his having built a house on the Caelian hill. Seeing how harsh and suspicious Rome was in these two instances, we may surmise that she would have shown the same ingratitude as Athens, had she, like Athens, been wronged by her citizens at an early stage of her growth, and before she had attained to the fullness of her strength. That I may not have to return to this question of ingratitude, I shall say all that remains to be said about it in my next chapter. Chapter 29. Whether a people or a prince is the more ungrateful. In connection with what has been said above, it seems proper to consider whether more notable instances of ingratitude are supplied by princes or peoples. And, to go to the root of the matter, I affirm that this vice of ingratitude has its source either in avarice or in suspicion. for a prince or people when they have sent forth a captain on some important enterprise, by succeeding in which he earns a great name, are bound in return to reward him. And if, moved by avarice and covetousness, they fail to do so, or if instead of rewarding they wrong and disgrace him, they commit an error which is not only without excuse, but brings with it undying infamy. And, in fact, we find many princes who have sinned in this way, for the cause given by Cornelius Tacitus when he says that men are readier to pay back injuries than benefits, since to requite a benefit is felt to be a burden, to return an injury a gain. When reward is withheld, or to speak more correctly, where offense is given, not from avarice but from suspicion, the prince or people may deserve some excuse, and we read of many instances of ingratitude proceeding from this cause. For the captain, who by his valor has won new dominions for his prince, since, while overcoming his enemies, he at the same time covers himself with glory and enriches his soldiers, must needs acquire such credit with his own followers and with the enemy, and also with the subjects of his prince, as cannot be wholly agreeable to the master who sent him forth. And since men are by nature ambitious as well as jealous, and none loves to set a limit to his fortunes, the suspicion which at once lays hold of the prince when he sees his captain victorious is sure to be inflamed by some arrogant act or word of the captain himself, so that the prince will be unable to think of anything but how to secure himself, and to this end will contrive how he may put his captain to death, or at any rate deprive him of the credit he has gained with the army and among the people, doing all he can to show that the victory was not won by his valor, but by good fortune, or by the cowardice of the enemy, or by the skill and prudence of those commanders who were with him at this or that battle. After Vespasian, who was then in Judea, had been proclaimed emperor by his army, Antonius Primus, who commanded another army in Illyria, adopted his cause, and marching into Italy against Vitellius, who had been proclaimed emperor in Rome, courageously defeated 2 armies under that prince, and occupied Rome, so that Mucialus, who was sent thither by Vespasian, found everything done to his hand, and all difficulties surmounted by the valor of Antonius. But all the reward that Antonius had for his pains was that Mucianus forthwith deprived him of the command of the army, and by degrees diminished his authority in Rome till none was left him. Thereupon Antonius went to join Vespasian, who was still in Asia, by whom he was so coldly received and so little considered that in despair he put himself to death. And of cases like this history is full. Every man living at the present hour knows with what zeal and courage Gonzalvo of Cordoba, while conducting the war in Naples against the French, conquered and subdued that kingdom for his master, Ferdinand of Aragon, and how his services were requited by Ferdinand, coming from Aragon to Naples, and, first of all, depriving him of the command of the army, afterwards of the fortresses, and finally carrying him back with him to Spain, where soon after he died in disgrace. This jealousy, then, is so natural to princes that they cannot guard themselves against it, and show gratitude to those who, serving under their standard, have gained great victories and made great conquests on their behalf. And if it be impossible for princes to free their minds from such suspicions, there is nothing strange or surprising that a people should be unable to do so. For as a city living under free institutions has 2 ends always before it, namely, to acquire liberty and to preserve it, it must be necessarily be led by its excessive passion for liberty to make mistakes in the pursuit of both of these objects. Of the mistakes it commits in the effort to acquire liberty, I shall speak hereafter in the proper place. Of the mistakes committed in the endeavor to preserve liberty are to be noted the injuring those citizens who ought to be rewarded, and the suspecting those who should be trusted. Now, although in a state which has grown corrupt, these errors occasion great evils, and commonly lead to a tyranny, as happened in Rome when Caesar took by force what ingratitude had denied him, they nevertheless are the cause of much good in the republic which has not been corrupted, since they prolong the duration of its free institutions, and make men, through fear of punishment, better and less ambitious. Of all peoples possessed of great power, the Romans, for the reasons I have given, have undoubtedly been the least ungrateful, since we have no other instance of their ingratitude to cite save that of Scipio. For both Coriolanus and Camillus were banished on account of the wrongs which they inflicted on the commons. And though the former was not forgiven because he constantly retained ill will against the people, the latter was not only recalled, but for the rest of his life honored as a prince. But the ingratitude shown towards Scipio arose from the suspicion with which the citizens came to regard him, which they had not felt in the case of the others, and which was occasioned by the greatness of the enemy whom he had overthrown, the fame he had won by prevailing in so dangerous and protracted a war, the suddenness of his victories, and finally, the favor which his youth, together with his prudence and his other memorable qualities, had gained for him. These qualities were, in truth, so remarkable that even the very magistrates, not to speak of others, stood in awe of his authority, a circumstance displeasing to prudent citizens, as before unheard of in Rome. In short, his whole bearing and character were so much out of the common that even the elder Cato, so celebrated for his austere virtue, was the first to declare against him, saying that no city could be deemed free which contained a citizen who was feared by the magistrates. And since, in this instance, the Romans followed the opinion of Cato, they merit that excuse, which, as I have said already, should be extended to the prince or people who are ungrateful through suspicion. In conclusion, it is to be said that this vice of ingratitude has its origin either in avarice or in suspicion, but commonwealths are rarely led into it by avarice, and far rarer by suspicion, having, as shall be presently shown, far less reason than princes for suspicion.
Chapter 30. How Princes and Commonwealths may avoid the vice of ingratitude, and how a captain or citizen may escape being undone by it. That he may not be tormented by suspicion, nor show ungrateful, a prince should go himself on his wars, as the Roman emperors did at first, as the Turk does now, and in short, as all valiant princes have done and do. For when it is the prince himself who conquers, the glory and the gain are all his own. But when he is absent, since the glory is another's, it will seem to the prince that he profits nothing by the gain, unless that glory be quenched, which he knew not how to win for himself. And when he thus becomes ungrateful and unjust, doubtless his loss is greater than his gain. To the prince, therefore, who either through indolence or from want of foresight sends forth a captain to conduct his wars while he himself remains inactive at home, I have no advice to offer which he does not already know. But I would counsel the captain whom he sends, since I am sure that he can never escape the attacks of ingratitude, to follow either one or the other of two courses, and either quit his command at once after a victory, and place himself in the hands of his prince, while carefully abstaining from any vainglorious or ambitious act, so that the prince, being relieved of all suspicion, may be disposed to reward, or at any rate not to injure him. Or else, should he think it inexpedient for him to act in this way, to take boldly the contrary course, and fearlessly to follow out all such measures as he thinks will secure for himself, and not for his prince, whatever he has gained, conciliating the goodwill of his soldiers and fellow citizens, forming new friendships with neighboring potentates, placing his own adherents in fortified towns, corrupting the chief officers of his army, and getting rid of those whom he fails to corrupt, and by all similar means endeavoring to punish his master for the ingratitude which he looks for at his hands. These are the only two courses open. But since, as I said before, men know not how to be wholly good or wholly bad, It will never happen that after a victory, a captain will quit his army and conduct himself modestly, nor yet will he venture to use those hardy methods which have in them some strain of greatness, and so, remaining undecided, he will be crushed while he still wavers and doubts. A commonwealth desiring to avoid the vice of ingratitude is, as compared with the prince, at this disadvantage, that while a prince can go himself on his expeditions, the commonwealth must send someone of its citizens. As a remedy, I would recommend that course being adopted which was followed by the Roman Republic, in order to be less ungrateful than others, having its origin in the nature of the Roman government. For the whole city, nobles and commons alike, taking part in her wars, there were always found in Rome, at every stage of her history, so many valiant and successful soldiers, that, by reason of their number, and from one acting as a check upon another, the nation had never ground to be jealous of any one man among them, while they, on their part, lived uprightly, and were careful to betray no sign of ambition, nor give the people the least cause to distrust them as ambitious, so that he obtained most glory from his dictatorship who was first to lay it down, which conduct, as it excited no suspicion, could occasion no ingratitude. We see then that the commonwealth which would have no cause to be ungrateful must act as Rome did, and that the citizen who would escape ingratitude must observe those precautions which were observed by Roman citizens.
Chapter 31. That the Roman captains were never punished with extreme severity for misconduct, and where loss resulted to the Republic merely through their ignorance or want of judgment, were not punished at all. The Romans were not only, as has been said above, less ungrateful than other republics, but were also more lenient and more considerate in punishing the captains of their armies. For if they erred of set purpose, they chastised them with gentleness, while if they erred through ignorance, so far from punishing, they even honored and rewarded them. And this conduct was well considered, for as they judged it of the utmost moment that those in command of their armies should have in all they had to do their minds undisturbed and free from external anxieties, they would not add further difficulty and danger to a task in itself both dangerous and difficult, lest none should ever be found to act with valor. For supposing them to be sending forth an army against Philip of Macedon in Greece, or against Hannibal in Italy, or against any other enemy at whose hands they had already sustained reverses, the captain in command of that expedition would be weighted with all the grave and important cares that attend such enterprises. But if to all these cares had been added the example of Roman generals crucified or otherwise put to death for having lost battles, it would have been impossible for a commander surrounded by so many causes for anxiety to have acted with vigor and decision. For which reason, and because they thought that to such persons the mere ignominy of defeat was in itself punishment enough, they would not dishearten their generals by inflicting on them any heavier penalty. Of errors committed, not through ignorance, is the following instance. Sergius and Virginius were engaged in the siege of Veii, each being in command of a division of the army. And while Sergius was set to guard against the approach of the Etruscans, it fell to Virginius to watch the town. But Sergius, being attacked by the Faliscans and other tribes, chose rather to be defeated and routed than ask aid from Virginius, who, on his part, awaiting the humiliation of his rival, was willing to see his country dishonored and an army destroyed, so long as going unasked to his relief. This was notable misconduct, and likely, unless both offenders were punished, to bring discredit on the Roman name. But whereas another republic would have punished these men with death, the Romans were content to inflict only a monetary fine, not because the offense in itself did not deserve severe handling, but because they were unwilling, for the reasons already given, to depart in this instance from their ancient practice. Of errors committed, not through ignorance, we have no better example than in the case of Varro, through whose rashness the Romans were defeated by Hannibal at Cannae, where the Republic well nigh lost its liberty.
But because he had acted through ignorance and with no evil design, they not only refrained from punishing him, but even treated him with distinction, the whole Senate going forth to meet him on his return to Rome, and, as they could not thank him for having fought, thanking him for having come back, and for not having despaired of the fortunes his country. Again, when Papirius Cursor would have had Fabius put to death, because, contrary to his orders, he had fought with the Samnites, among the reasons pleaded by the father of Fabius against the persistence of the dictator, he urged that never on the occasion of the defeat of any of their captains had the Romans done what Papirius wanted them to do on the occasion of a victory. Chapter 32. That a prince or commonwealth should not delay conferring benefits until they are themselves in difficulties. The Romans found it for their advantage to be generous to the commons at a season of danger, when Porcina came to attack Rome and restore the Tarquins. For the Senate, apprehending that the people might choose rather to take back their kings than to support a war, secured their adherence by relieving them of the duty on salt and of all their other burdens, saying that the poor did enough for the common welfare in rearing their offspring. For in return for this indulgence, the commons were content to undergo war, siege, and famine. Let no one, however, relying on this example, delay conciliating the people till danger has actually come, or, if he do, let him not hope to have the same good fortune as the Romans. For the mass of the people will consider that they have to thank not him, but his enemies, and that there is ground to fear that when the danger has passed away, he will take back what he gave under compulsion, and therefore to him they lie under no obligation. And the reason why the course followed by the Romans succeeded was that the state was still new and unsettled. Besides which, the people knew that laws had already been passed in their favor, for instance, the law allowing an appeal to the tribunes, and could therefore persuade themselves that the benefits granted them proceeded from the goodwill entertained towards them by the Senate, and were not due merely to the approach of an enemy. But since like conditions seldom recur, it can only rarely happen that like remedies are useful. Wherefore all, whether princes or republics, who hold the reins of government, ought to think beforehand of the adverse times which may await them, and of what help they may then stand in need of, and ought to live with their people as they would think right were they suffering under any calamity. And whosoever, whether prince or republic, but prince more especially, behaves otherwise, and believes that after the event, and when danger is upon him, he will be able to win men over by benefits, deceives himself, and will not merely maintain his place, but will even precipitate his downfall. Chapter 33. When a mischief has grown up in or against a state, it is safer to temporize with it than to meet it with violence. As Rome grew in fame, power, and dominion, her neighbors, who at first had taken no heed to the injury which this new republic might do them, began too late to see their mistake, and desiring to remedy what should have been remedied before, combined against her to the number of 40 nations. Whereupon the Romans, resorting to a method usual with them in seasons of peril, appointed a dictator, that is, gave power to one man to decide without advice and carry out his resolves without appeal. Which expedient, as it then enabled them to overcome the dangers by which they were threatened, so always proved most serviceable when, at any time during the growth of their power, difficulties arose to embarrass their republic. In connection with this league against Rome, we have first to note that when a mischief which springs up either in or against a republic, and whether occasioned by internal or external causes, has grown to such proportions that it begins to fill the whole community with alarm, it is a far safer course to temporize with it than to attempt to quell it by violence. For commonly, those who make this attempt only add fuel to the flame, and hasten the impending ruin. Such disorders arise in a republic more often from internal causes than external, either through some citizen being suffered to acquire undue influence, or from the corruption of some institution of that republic which had once been the life and sinew of its freedom, and from this corruption being allowed to gain such head that the attempt to check it is more dangerous than to let it be. And it is all the harder to recognize these disorders in their beginning, because it seems natural to men to look with favor on the beginnings of things. Favor of this sort is attracted more by anything else than by those actions which seem to have in them a quality of greatness, or which are performed by the young. For when in a republic some young man is seen to come forward endowed with rare excellence, the eyes of all the citizens are at once turned upon him, and all, without distinction, concur to do him honor. So that if he have one spark of ambition, the advantages which he has from nature, together with those he takes from this favorable disposition of men's minds, raise him to such a pitch of power, that when the citizens at last see their mistake, it is almost impossible for them to correct it. And when they do what they can to oppose his influence, the only result is to extend it. Of this I might cite numerous examples, but shall content myself with one that relates to our own city. Cosimo de' Medici, to whom the house of the Medici in Florence owes the origin of its fortunes, acquired so great a name from the favor with which his own prudence and the blindness of others invested him, that coming to be held in awe by the government, his fellow citizens deemed it dangerous to offend him, but still more dangerous to let him alone. Niccolò d'Aruzzano, who was accounted well versed in all civil affairs, but who had made a first mistake in not discerning the dangers which might grow from the rising influence of Cosimo, would never while he lived permit a second mistake to be made in attempting to crush him, judging that such an attempt would be the ruin of the state, as in truth it proved after his death. For some who survived him, disregarding his counsels, combined against Cosimo and banished him from Florence. And so it came about that the partisans of Cosimo, angry at the wrong done him, soon afterwards recalled him and made him prince of the republic, a dignity he never would have reached but for this open opposition. The very same thing happened in Rome in the case of Caesar. For his services, having gained him the goodwill of Pompey and other citizens, their favor was presently turned to fear, as Cicero testifies, where he says that it was late that Pompey began to fear Caesar. This fear led men to think of remedies, and the remedies to which they resorted accelerated the destruction of the republic. I say then, that since it is difficult to recognize these disorders in their beginning, because of the false impressions which things produce at the first, it is a wiser course, when they become known, to temporize with them than to oppose them. For when you temporize, either they die out of themselves, or at any rate the injury they do is deferred. And the prince who would suppress such disorders, or oppose himself to their force and onset, must always be on his guard, lest he help where he would hinder, retard when he would advance, and drown the plant he thinks to water. He must therefore study well the symptoms of the disease, and if he believe himself able to the cure, grapple with it fearlessly. If not, he must let it be, and not attempt to treat it in any way. For otherwise it will fare with him as it fared with those neighbors of Rome, for whom it would have been safer, after that city had grown to be so great, to have sought to soothe and restrain her by peaceful arts, than to provoke her by open war, to contrive new means of attack and new methods of defense. For this league had no other effect than to make the Romans more united and resolute than before, and to bethink themselves of new expedients, whereby their power was still more rapidly advanced, among which was the creation of a dictator. For this innovation not only enabled them to surmount the dangers which then threatened them, but was afterwards the means of escaping infinite calamities, into which, without it, the Republic must have fallen.
Chapter 34. That the authority of the dictator did good and not harm to the Roman Republic, and that it is not those powers which are given by the free suffrages of the people, but those which ambitious citizens usurp for themselves, that are pernicious to a state. Those citizens who first devised a dictatorship for Rome have been blamed by certain writers, as though this had been the cause of the tyranny afterwards established there.
For these authors allege that the first tyrant of Rome governed it with the title of dictator, and that but for the existence of the office, Caesar could never have cloaked his usurpation under a constitutional name. He who first took up this opinion had not well considered the matter, and his conclusion has been accepted without good ground. For it was not the name nor office of dictator which brought Rome to servitude, but the influence which certain of her citizens were able to assume from the prolongation of their term of power. So that even had the name of dictator been wanting in Rome, some other had been found to serve their ends, since power may readily give titles, but not titles power. We find accordingly that while the dictatorship was conferred in conformity with public ordinances, and not through personal influence, it was constantly beneficial to the city. For the magistrates created, and the powers usurped in unconstitutional ways that hurt a republic, not those which conform to ordinary rule. So that in Rome, through the whole period of her history, we never find a dictator who acted anything other than well for the republic, for which there were the plainest reasons. In the first place, to enable a citizen to work harm and to acquire undue authority, many circumstances must be present, which never can be present in a state which is not corrupted. For such a citizen must be exceedingly rich and have many retainers and partisans, whom he cannot have where the laws are strictly observed, and who, if he had them, would occasion so much alarm that the free suffrages of the people would seldom be in his favor. In the second place, the dictator was not created for life, but for a fixed term, and only to meet the emergency for which he was appointed. Power was indeed given him to determine by himself what measures the exigency demanded, to do what he had to do without consultation, and to punish without appeal. But he had no authority to do anything to the prejudice of the state, as it would have been to deprive the Senate or the people of their privileges, to subvert the ancient institutions of the city, or to introduce new. So that taking into account the brief time for which his office lasted, its limited authority, and the circumstances that the Roman people were still uncorrupted, it was impossible for him to overstep the just limits of his power, so as to injure the city. And in fact, we find that he was always useful to it. And in truth, among the institutions of Rome, this of the dictatorship deserves our special admiration, and to be linked with the chief causes of her greatness. For without some such safeguard, a city can hardly pass unharmed through extraordinary dangers. Because as the ordinary institutions of a commonwealth work but slowly, no council and no magistrate having authority to act in everything alone, but in most matters one standing in need of the other, and time being required to reconcile their differences, the remedies that they provide are most dangerous when they have to be applied in cases which do not brook delay. For which reason, every republic ought to have some resource of this nature provided by its constitution, as we find that the Republic of Venice, one of the best of those now existing, has, in cases of urgent danger, reserved authority to a few of her citizens, if agreed among themselves, to determine without further consultation what course is to be followed. When a republic is not provided with some such safeguard, such as this, either it must be ruined by observing constitutional forms, or else, to save it, these must be broken through. But in a republic, nothing should be left to be effected by irregular methods, because although for the time the irregularity may be useful, the example will nevertheless be pernicious, as giving rise to a practice of violating the laws for good ends, under the color of which they may afterwards be violated for ends which are not good. For which reason, that can never become a perfect republic in which every contingency has not been foreseen and provided for by the laws, and the method of dealing with it defined. To sum up, therefore, I say that republics which cannot in sudden emergencies resort to either a dictator or to some similar authority will always, when the danger is serious, be undone. We may note, moreover, how prudently the Romans, in introducing this new office, contrived the conditions under which it was to be exercised. For perceiving that the appointment of a dictator involved something of humiliation for the consuls, who from being the heads of the state were reduced to render obedience like everyone else, and anticipating that this might give offense, they determined that the power to appoint rest with the consuls, thinking that when the occasion came that Rome should need this regal authority, they would have the consuls acting willingly and feeling the less aggrieved from the appointment being in their own hands. For those wounds or injuries which a man inflicts on himself by choice and of his own free will pain him far less than those inflicted by another. Nevertheless, in the later days of the Republic, the Romans were wont to entrust this power to a consul instead of a dictator, using the formula videat consul ne quid respublica detrimentum capiat. But to return to the matter at hand, I say briefly that when the neighbors of Rome sought to crush her, they led her to take measures not merely for her readier defense, but such as enabled her to attack them with a stronger force, with better skill, and with an undivided command.
Chapter 35. Why the creation of the decemvirate in Rome, although brought about by the free and open suffrage of the citizens, was hurtful to the liberties of that republic. The fact of those 10 citizens who were chosen by the Roman people to make laws for Rome, in time becoming their tyrants and depriving her of her freedom, may seem contrary to what I have said above, namely that it is the authority which is violently usurped, and not that conferred by the free suffrage of the people, that is injurious to a republic. Here, however, we have to take into account both the mode in which, and for the term for which, authority is given. Where authority is unrestricted and is conferred for a long term, meaning by that for a year or more, it is always attended with danger, and its results will be good or bad according to the men to whom it is committed. Now, when we compare the authority of the 10 with that possessed by the dictator, we see that the power placed in the hands of the former was out of all proportion greater than that entrusted to the latter. For when a dictator was appointed, there still remained the tribunes, the consuls, and the senate, all of them invested with authority of which the dictator could not deprive them. For even if he could have taken his consulship from one man, or his status as a senator from another, he could not abolish the senatorial rank, nor pass new laws, so that the senate, the consuls, and the tribunes continuing with undiminished authority were a check upon him, and kept him in the right road. But on the creation of the 10, the opposite of all this took place. For on their appointment, consuls and tribunes were swept away, and express powers were given to the new magistrates to make laws and do whatever else they thought fit, with the entire authority of the whole Roman people. So that finding themselves alone, without consuls or tribunes to control them, and with no appeal against them to the people, and thus there being none to keep a watch on them, and further being stimulated by the ambition of Appius, in the 2nd year of their office they began to wax insolent. Let it be noted, therefore, that when it is said that authority given by the public vote is never hurtful to any commonwealth, it is assumed that the people will never be led to confer that authority without due limitations, or for other than a reasonable term. Should they, however, from being deceived, or otherwise blinded, be induced to bestow authority imprudently, as the Romans bestowed it on the 10, it will always fare with them as with the Romans. And this may be readily understood on reflecting what causes operated to keep the dictator good, what to make the 10 bad, and by observing how those republics that have been accounted well governed have acted when conferring authority for an extended period, as the Spartans on their kings, and the Venetians on their doges. For it will be seen that in both these instances, the authority was controlled by checks that made it impossible for it to be abused. But where an uncontrolled authority is given, no security is afforded by the circumstance that the body of the people is not corrupted. For in the briefest possible time, absolute authority will make a people corrupt, and obtain for itself friends and partisans. Nor will it be any hindrance to him in whom such authority is vested, that he is poor and without connections. For wealth and every other advantage will quickly follow, as shall be more fully shown when we discuss the appointment of the 10.
Chapter 36. That citizens who have held the higher offices of a commonwealth should not disdain the lower ones. Under the consuls M. A. Fabius and G. N. Manlius, The Romans had a memorable victory in a battle fought with the Veientines and the Etruscans, in which Q. Fabius, brother of the consul, who had himself been consul the year before, was slain. This event may lead us to remark how well the methods followed by the city of Rome were suited to increase her power, and how great a mistake is made by other republics in departing from them. For either as the Romans were in the pursuit of glory, they never esteemed it a dishonor to obey one whom before they had commanded, or to find themselves serving in the ranks of an army which they once had led. This usage, however, is opposed to the ideas, the rules, and practice which prevail at the present day, as for instance in Venice, where the notion still obtains that a citizen who has filled a great office should be ashamed to accept a less, and where the state itself permits him to decline it. This course, assuming it to lend luster to individual citizens, is plainly to the disadvantage of the community, which has reason to hope more from, and trust more to, the citizen who descends from a high office to fill a lower one, than him who rises from a low office to fill a high one. For in the latter no confidence can reasonably be placed, unless he be seen to have others about him of such credit and worth that it may be hoped their wise counsels and influence will correct his inexperience. But had the usage which prevails in Venice and in other modern commonwealths and kingdoms prevailed in Rome, whereby he who had once been consul was never afterwards to go with the army except as consul, numberless results must have followed, detrimental to the free institutions of that city, as well from the mistakes which the inexperience of new men would have occasioned, as because from their ambition having a freer course, and from having none near them in whose presence they might fear to do amiss, they would have grown less scrupulous, and in this way the public service must have suffered grave harm. Chapter 37. Of the mischief bred in Rome by the agrarian law, and how it is a great source of disorder in a commonwealth to pass a law opposed to ancient usage and with stringent retrospective effect. It has been said by ancient writers that to be pinched by adversity or pampered by prosperity is the common lot of men, and that in whichever way they are acted upon, the result is the same. For when no longer urged to war on one another by necessity, they are urged by ambition, which has such dominion in their hearts that it leaves them never, to whatsoever heights they climb. For nature has so ordered it that while they desire everything, it is impossible for them to have everything, and thus their desires being always in excess of their capacity to gratify them, they remain constantly dissatisfied and discontented, and hence the vicissitudes in human affairs. For some seeking to enlarge their possessions, and some to keep what they have got, wars and enmities ensue, from which result the ruin of one country and the growth of another. I am led to these reflections from observing that the commons of Rome were not content to secure themselves against the nobles by the creation of tribunes, a measure to which they were driven by necessity, but after effecting this, forthwith entered on an ambitious contest with the nobles, seeking to share with them what all men most esteem, namely their honors and their wealth. Hence was bred that disorder from which sprang the feuds relating to the agrarian laws, and which led in the end to the downfall of the Roman Republic. And although it should be the object of every well-governed commonwealth to make the state rich and keep individual citizens poor, it must be allowed that in the matter of this law the city of Rome was to blame, whether for having passed it in such a shape as to require it to be continually recast, or for having postponed it so long that its retrospective effect was the occasion of tumult, or else because although rightly framed at first, it had come in its operation to be perverted. But in whatever way it happened, so it was that this law was never spoken of in Rome without the whole city being convulsed. The law itself embraced two principal provisions. By one, it was enacted that no citizen should possess more than a fixed number of acres of land. By the other, that all lands taken from the enemy should be distributed among the whole people. A twofold blow was thus aimed at the nobles, since all who possessed more land than the law allowed, as most of the nobles did, fell to be deprived of it, and by dividing the lands of the enemy among the whole people, the road to wealth was closed. These two grounds of offense being given to a powerful class, to whom it appeared that by resisting the law they did a service to the state, the whole city, as I have said, was thrown into an uproar on the mere mention of its name. The nobles, indeed, sought to temporize and to prevail by patience and address, sometimes calling out the army, sometimes opposing another tribune to the one who was promoting the law, or sometimes coming to a compromise by sending a colony into the lands that were to be divided, as was done in the case of the territory of Antium, whither on a dispute concerning the law having arisen, settlers were sent from Rome and the land made over to them. Of speaking of which colony, Titus Livius makes the notable remark that hardly anyone in Rome could be got to take part in it, so much readier were the commons to indulge in covetous schemes at home than to realize them by leaving it. The ill humor engendered by this contest continued to prevail until the Romans began to carry their arms into the remoter parts of Italy and to countries beyond its shores, after which it seemed for a time to slumber. And this because the lands held by the enemies of Rome, out of sight of her citizens and too remote to be conveniently cultivated, came to be less desired. Whereupon the Romans grew less eager to punish their enemies by dividing their lands, and were content, when they deprived any city of its territory, to send colonists to occupy it. For causes such as these, the measure remained in abeyance down to the time of the Gracchi, but being by them revived, finally overthrew the liberty of Rome. For as it found the power of its adversaries doubled, such a flame of hatred was kindled between the commons and senate that regardless of all civil restraints, they resolved to resort to arms and bloodshed. And as the public magistrates were powerless to provide a remedy, each of the two factions, having no longer any hopes from them, resolved to do what it could for itself, and to set up a chief for its own protection. On reaching this stage of tumult and disorder, the commons lent their influence to Marius, making him 4 times consul, whose authority lasting thus long, and with very brief intervals, became so firmly rooted that he was able to make himself consul other 3 times. Against this scourge, the nobles, lacking other defense, set themselves to favor Sulla, and placing him at the head of their faction, entered on the civil wars, wherein after much blood had been spilt, and after many changes of fortune, they got the better of their adversaries. But afterwards, in the time of Caesar and Pompey, the distemper broke out afresh, for Caesar heading the Marian party, and Pompey that of Sulla, and war ensuing, the victory remained with Caesar, who was the first tyrant in Rome, after whose time that city was never again free. Such, therefore, was the beginning, and such the end, of the agrarian law. But since it has been elsewhere said that the struggle between the commons and senate of Rome preserved her liberties, as giving rise to laws favorable to freedom, it might seem that the consequences of the agrarian law are opposed to that view. I am not, however, led to alter my opinion on this account, for I maintain that the ambition of the great is so pernicious that unless controlled and counteracted in a variety of ways, it will always reduce a city to speedy ruin. So that if the controversy over the agrarian laws took 300 years to bring Rome to slavery, she would in all likelihood have been brought to slavery in a far shorter time had the commons, not by means of this law, and by other demands, constantly restrained the ambition of the nobles. We may also learn from this contest how much more men value wealth than honors. For in the matter of honors, the Roman nobles always gave way to the commons without any extraordinary resistance. But when it came to be a question of property, so stubborn were they in its defense that the commons, to effect their ends, had to resort to those irregular methods which have been described above, of which the irregularities were the prime movers of the Gracchi,
whose motives are more to be commended than their measures, since to pass a law with stringent retrospective effect in order to remove an abuse of long standing in a republic is an unwise step, and one which, as I have already shown at length, can have no other result than to accelerate the mischief to which the abuse leads. Whereas, if you temporize, either the abuse develops more slowly, or else, in course of time, and before it comes to a head, dies out of itself.
Chapter 38. That weak republics are irresolute and undecided, and that the course they may take depends more on necessity than choice. A terrible pestilence breaking out in Rome seemed to the Equians and Volscians to offer a fit opportunity for crushing her. The two nations, therefore, assembling a great army, attacked the Latins and Hernicians and laid waste their country. Whereupon the Latins and Hernicians were forced to make their case known to the Romans and to ask to be defended by them. The Romans, who were sorely afflicted by the pestilence, answered that they must look to their own defense and with their own forces, since Rome was in no position to succor them. Here we recognize the prudence and magnanimity of the Roman Senate, and how at all times and in all changes of fortune they assumed the responsibility of determining the course their country should take, and were not ashamed, when necessary, to decide on a course contrary to that which was usual with them, or which they had decided to follow on some other occasion. I say this because on other occasions this same Senate had forbidden these nations to defend themselves, and a less prudent assembly might have thought it lowered their credit to withdraw that prohibition. But the Roman Senate always took a sound view of things, and always accepted the least hurtful course as the best. So that, although it was distasteful to them not to be able to defend their subjects, and equally distasteful, for both the reasons given and for others which may be understood, that their subjects should take up arms in their absence, nevertheless, knowing that these must have recourse to arms in any case, since the enemy was upon them, they took an honorable course in deciding that what had to be done should be done with their leave, lest men driven to disobey by necessity should come afterwards to disobey from choice. And although this may seem the course which every republic ought reasonably to follow, nevertheless weak and badly advised republics cannot make up their minds to follow it, not knowing how to do themselves honor in like extremities. After Duke Valentino had taken Faenza and forced Bologna to yield to his terms, desiring to return to Rome through Tuscany, he sent one of his people to Florence to ask leave for himself and his army to pass. A council was held in Florence to consider how this request should be dealt with, but no one was favorable to the leave asked for being granted, wherein the Roman method was not followed. For as the Duke had a very strong force with him, and the Florentines were so bare of troops that they could not have prevented his passage, it would have been far more for their credit that he should seem to pass with their consent than in spite of them, because while discredit had to be incurred either way, they would have incurred less by acceding to his demand. But of all courses, the worst for a weak state is to be irresolute, for then whatever it does will seem to be done under compulsion, so that if by chance it should do anything well, this will be set down to necessity and not to prudence. Of this I shall cite two other instances happening in our own times and in our own country. In the year 1500, King Louis of France, after recovering Milan, desiring to restore Pisa to the Florentines, so as to obtain payment from them of the 50,000 ducats which they had promised him on the restitution being completed, sent troops to Pisa under Monsieur Beaumont, in whom, though a Frenchman, the Florentines put much trust. Beaumont accordingly took up his position with his forces between Cassina and Pisa, to be in readiness to attack the town. After he had been there for some days, making arrangements for the assault, envoys came to him from Pisa, offering to surrender their city to the French if a promise were given in the king's name, not to hand it over to the Florentines until 4 months had run through. This condition was absolutely rejected by the Florentines, and the siege being proceeded with, they were forced to retire with disgrace. Now the proposal of the Pisans was rejected by the Florentines, for no other reason than that they distrusted the good faith of the king, into whose hands their weakness obliged them to commit themselves, and did not reflect how much more it was for their interest that by obtaining entrance into Pisa, he should have it in his power to restore the town to them, or failing to restore it, to show his designs at once. Then remaining outside, he should put them off with promises for which they had to pay. So it would have been a far better course for the Florentines to have agreed to Beaumont taking possession on whatever terms. This was seen afterwards in the year 1502, when on the revolt of Arezzo, Monsieur Imbault was sent by the King of France to assist the Florentines. For when he got near Arezzo and began to negotiate with the Aretines, who, like the Pisans, were willing to surrender their town on terms, the acceptance of these terms was strongly disapproved in Florence, which Imbault learning, and thinking that the Florentines were acting with little sense, he took the entire settlement of conditions into his own hands, and without consulting the Florentine commissioners, concluded an arrangement to his own satisfaction, in execution of which he entered Arezzo with his army. And he let the Florentines know that he thought them fools and ignorant of the ways of the world, since if they desired to have Arezzo, they could signify their wishes to the king, who would be much better able to give it to them when he had his soldiers inside the town than when he had them outside the town. Nevertheless, in Florence they never ceased to blame and abuse Monsieur Imbault, until at last they came to see that if Beaumont had acted in the same way, they would have gotten possession of Pisa as well as Arezzo. Applying what has been said to the matter at hand, we find that irresolute republics, unless upon compulsion, never follow wise courses. For wherever there is room for doubt, their weakness will not suffer them to come to any resolve, so that unless their doubts be overcome by some superior force which impels them forward, they remain always in suspense.
Chapter 39. That often the same accidents are seen to befall different nations. Anyone comparing the present with the past will soon perceive that in all cities and in all nations there prevail the same desires and passions as always have prevailed, for which reason it should be an easy matter for him who carefully examines past events to foresee those that are about to happen in any republic, and to apply such remedies as the ancients have used in like cases, or, finding none which have been used by them, to strike out new ones, such as they might have used in similar circumstances. But these lessons, being neglected or not understood by readers, or, if understood by them, being unknown to rulers, it follows that the same disorders are common to all times. In the year 1494, the Republic of Florence, having lost a portion of its territories, including Pisa and other towns, was forced to make war against those who had taken possession of them, who being powerful, it followed that great sums were spent on these wars to little purpose. This large expenditure had to be met by heavy taxes, which gave occasion to numberless complaints on the part of the people. And inasmuch as the war was conducted by a council of 10 citizens, who were styled the 10 of the war, the multitude began to regard these with displeasure, as though they were the cause of the war and of the consequent expenditure, and at last persuaded themselves that if they got rid of this magistracy, there would be an end to the war. Wherefore, when the magistracy of the 10 should have been renewed, the people did not renew it, but, suffering it to lapse, entrusted their affairs to the Signory. This course was most pernicious, since not only did it fail to put an end to the war, as the people expected it would, but by setting aside men who had conducted it with prudence, led to such mishaps that not Pisa only, but Arezzo also, and many other towns besides, were lost to Florence. Whereupon the people, recognizing their mistake, and that the evil was in the disease and not in the physician, reinstated the magistracy of the 10.
Similar dissatisfaction grew up in Rome against the consular authority. For the people, seeing one war follow another, and that they were never allowed to rest, when they should have ascribed this to the ambition of neighboring nations who desired their overthrow, ascribed it to the ambition of the nobles, who, as they believed, being unable to wreak their hatred against them within the city, where they were protected by the power of the tribunes, sought to lead them outside the city, where they were under the authority of the consuls, to that they might crush them where they were without help. In this belief, they thought it necessary either to get rid of the consuls altogether, or to so restrict their powers as to leave them no authority over the people, either in the city or out of it. The first to attempt to pass a law in this effect was the tribune Terentilius, who proposed that a committee of 5 be named to consider and regulate the power of the consuls. This roused the anger of the nobles, to whom it seemed that the greatness of their authority was about to set forever, and that no part would be left them in the administration of the republic. Such was the obstinacy of the tribunes that they succeeded in abolishing the consular title, and were not satisfied until, after other changes, it was resolved that in room of consuls, tribunes should be appointed with consular powers. So much greater was their hatred of the name than of the thing. For a long time matters remained on this footing, until, eventually, the commons, discovering their mistake, resumed the appointment of consuls, in the same way as the Florentines reverted to the 10 of the war. Chapter 40. Of the creation of the decemvirate in Rome, and what therein is to be noted, wherein, among other matters, is shown how the same causes may lead to the safety or to the ruin of a commonwealth. It being my desire to treat fully of those disorders which arose in Rome on the creation of the decemvirate, I think it not amiss, first of all, to relate what took place at the time of that creation, and then to discuss those circumstances attending it which seem most to deserve notice. These are numerous, and should be well considered, both by those who would maintain the liberties of a commonwealth, and by those who would subvert them. For in the course of our inquiry it will be seen that many mistakes prejudicial to freedom were made by the Senate and people, and that many were likewise made by Appius Claudius, the chief decemvirate, prejudicial to that tyranny which it was his aim to establish in Rome. After much controversy and wrangling between the commons and the nobles as to the framing of new laws by which the freedom of Rome might be better secured, Spurius Postumius and 2 other citizens were, by general consent, dispatched to Athens to procure copies of the laws which Solon had drawn up for the Athenians, to the end that these might serve as a groundwork for the laws of Rome. On their return, the next step was to depute certain persons to examine these laws and to draft the new code, for which purpose a commission consisting of 10 members, among whom was Appius Claudius, a crafty and ambitious citizen, was appointed for a year, and that the commissioners, in framing their laws, might act without fear or favor. All the other magistracies, and in particular the consulate and tribuneship, were suspended, and the appeal to the people discontinued, so that the decemvirates came to be absolute in Rome. Very soon the whole authority of the commissioners came to be centered in Appius, owing to the favor in which he was held by the commons. For although before he had been regarded as the cruel persecutor of the people, now he showed himself so conciliatory in his bearing that men wondered at the sudden change in his character and disposition. This set of commissioners, then, behaved discreetly, being attended by no more than 12 lictors, walking in front of that decemvirate that the rest put forward as their chief. And though vested with absolute authority, yet when a Roman citizen had to be tried for murder, they cited him before the people, and caused him to be judged by them. Their laws they wrote on 10 tables, but before signing them they exposed them publicly, that everyone might read and consider them, and if any defect were discovered in them, it might be corrected before they were finally passed. At this juncture, Appius caused it to be notified throughout the city that were 2 other tables added to these 10, the laws would be complete, hoping that under this belief the people would consent to continue the decemvirate for another year. This consent the people willingly gave, partly to prevent the consuls being reinstated, and partly because they thought they could hold their ground without the aid of the tribunes, who, as has already been said, were the judges in criminal cases. On it being resolved to reappoint the decemvirate, all the nobles set to canvass for the office, Appius among the foremost, and such cordiality did he display toward the commons while seeking their votes, that the other candidates, unable to persuade themselves that so much affability on the part of such a proud man was wholly uninterested, began to suspect him, but fearing to oppose him openly, sought to circumvent him by putting him forward, though the youngest of them all, to declare to the people the names of the proposed decemvirates, thinking that he would not venture to name himself, that being unusual in Rome and held discreditable. But what they meant as a hindrance he turned to account, by proposing to the surprise and displeasure of the whole nobility his own name first, and then nominating 9 others on whose support he thought he could depend. The new appointments, which were to last for a year, having been made, Appius soon let both the commons and the nobles know the mistake they had committed, for, throwing off the mask, he allowed his innate arrogance to appear, and speedily infected his colleagues with the same spirit, who, to overawe the people and the Senate, instead of 12 lictors, appointed 120. For a time their measures were directed against high and low alike, but presently they began to intrigue with the Senate and to attack the commons. And if any of the commons, on being harshly used by one decemvirate, ventured to appeal to another, he was worse handled on the appeal than in the first instance. The commons, on discovering their error, began in their despair to turn their eyes toward the nobles, and to look for a breeze of freedom from that very quarter whence, fearing slavery, they had brought the republic to its present straits. To the nobles, the sufferings of the commons were not displeasing, from the hope that, disgusted with the existing state of affairs, they too might come to desire the restoration of the consuls. When the year for which the decemvirates were appointed at last came to an end, the 2 additional tables of the law were ready, but had not yet been published. This was made a pretext by them for prolonging their magistracy, which they took measures to retain by force, gathering round them for this purpose a retinue of young noblemen, whom they enriched with the goods of those citizens whom they had condemned. Corrupted by which gifts, these youths came to prefer selfish license to public freedom. It happened that at this time the Sabines and Volscians began to stir up a war against Rome, and it was during the alarm thereby occasioned that the decemvirates were first made aware how weak was their position, for without the Senate they could take no warlike measures, while by assembling the Senate they seemed to put an end to their own authority. Nevertheless, being driven to it by necessity, they took this latter course. When the Senate met, many of the senators, but particularly Valerius and Horatius, inveighed against the insolence of the decemvirates, whose power would forthwith have been cut short had the Senate, through jealousy of the commons, declined to exercise their authority. For they thought that were the decemvirates to lay down office of their own free will, tribunes might not be reappointed. Wherefore they decided for war, and sent forth the armies under command of certain of the decemvirates. But Appius, remaining behind to govern the city, it so fell that he became enamored of Virginia, and that when he sought to lay violent hands upon her, Virginia, her father, to save her from dishonor, slew her. Thereupon followed tumults in Rome, and mutiny among the soldiers, who, making common cause with the rest of the plebeians, betook themselves to the sacred hill, and there remained until the decemvirates laid down their office. When tribunes and consuls were once more appointed, Rome was restored to her ancient freedom. In these events we note first of all that the pernicious step of creating this tyranny in Rome was due to the same causes which commonly give rise to tyrannies in cities, namely the excessive love of the people for liberty and the passionate eagerness of the nobles to govern. For when they cannot agree to pass some measure favorable to freedom, one faction or the other sets itself to support some one man, and a tyranny at once springs up. Both parties in Rome consented to the creation of the decemvirates and to their exercising unrestricted powers, from the desire that one had to put an end to the consular name, and the other to abolish the authority of the tribunes, by which objectives both were blinded so as to fall into all the disorders that ensued. For, as King Fernando was wont to say, men often behave as certain of the smaller birds, which are so intent on the prey to which nature incites them, that they discern not the eagle hovering overhead for their destruction. In this discourse, then, the mistakes made by the Roman people in their efforts to preserve their freedom, and the mistakes made by Appius in his endeavor to obtain the tyranny, have, as I proposed at the outset, been plainly shown.
Chapter 41. It is unwise to pass at a bound from leniency to severity, or to a haughty bearing from a humble. Among the crafty devices used by Appius to aid him in maintaining his authority, this of suddenly passing from one character to the extreme opposing one was of no small prejudice to him. For his fraud in pretending to the commons to be well disposed towards them was happily contrived, as were also the means he took to bring about the reappointment of the decemvirate. Most skillful, too, was his audacity in nominating himself contrary to the expectation of the nobles, and in proposing colleagues on whom he could depend to carry out his ends. But, as I have said already, it was not happily contrived that after doing all this, he should suddenly turn around, and from being the friend, reveal himself the enemy, haughty instead of humane, cruel instead of kindly, and make this change so rapidly as to leave himself no shadow of excuse, but compel all to recognize the doubleness of his nature. For he who has once seemed good, should he afterwards choose for his own ends to become bad, ought to change by slow degrees, and as opportunity serves, so that before his altered nature strip him of old favor, he may have gained for himself an equal share of new, and thus his influence suffer no diminution. For otherwise, being at once unmasked and friendless, he is undone.
Chapter 42. How easily men become corrupted. In this matter of the decemvirate, we may likewise note the ease wherewith men become corrupted, and how completely, although born good and well brought up, they change their nature. For we see how favorably disposed the youths whom Appius gathered round him became towards his tyranny, in return for the trifling benefits which they drew from it, and how Quintus Fabius, one of the second decemvirate, and a most worthy man, blinded by a little ambition, and misled by the evil counsels of Appius, abandoning his fair fame, betook him to most unworthy courses, and grew like his master. Careful consideration of this should make those who frame laws for commonwealths and kingdoms more alive to the necessity of placing restraints on men's evil appetites and depriving them of all hope of doing wrong with impunity. Chapter 43. That men fighting in their own cause make good and resolute soldiers. From what has been touched upon above, we are also led to remark how wide is the difference between an army which, having no ground for discontent, fights in its own cause, and one which, being discontented, fights to satisfy the ambition of others. For whereas the Romans were always victorious under the consuls, under the decemvirs they were always defeated. This helps us to understand why it is that mercenary troops are worthless, namely that they have no incitement to keep them true to you beyond the pittance which you pay them, which is neither nor can be a sufficient motive for such fidelity and devotion as would make them willing to die in your behalf.
but in those armies in which there exists not such an attachment towards him for whom they fight as makes them devoted to his cause, there never will be valor enough to withstand an enemy if only he be a little brave. And since such attachment and devotion cannot be looked for from any save your own subjects, you must, if you would preserve your dominions or maintain your commonwealth or kingdom, arm the natives of your country, as we see to have been done by all those who have achieved great things in war. Under the decemvirs, the ancient valor of the Roman soldiers had in no degree abated. Yet because they were no longer animated by the same good will, they did not exert themselves as they wont. But so soon as the decemvirate came to an end, and the soldiers began once more to fight as free men, the old spirit was reawakened, and as a consequence, their enterprises, according to former usage, were brought to a successful close. Chapter 44. That the multitude is helpless without a head, and that we should not with the same breath threaten and ask leave. When Virginia died by her father's hand, the commons of Rome withdrew under arms to the sacred hill, whereupon the Senate sent messengers to demand by what sanction they had deserted their commanders and assembled there in arms. And in such reverence was the authority of the Senate held, that the commons, lacking leaders, durst not make any reply. Not that they were at a loss what to answer, says Titus Livius, but because they had none to answer for them. Words which clearly show how helpless a thing is the multitude when without a head. This defect was perceived by Virginius, at whose instance 20 military tribunes were appointed by the commons to be their spokesmen with the Senate and to negotiate terms, who, having asked that Valerius and Horatius might be sent to them, to whom their wishes would be made known, these declined to go until the decemvirs had laid down their office. When this was done, and Valerius and Horatius came to the hill where the commons were assembled, the latter demanded that tribunes of the people should be appointed, that in future there should be an appeal to the people from the magistrates of whatever degree, and that all the decemvirs should be given to them to be burned alive. Valerius and Horatius approved the first two demands, but rejected the last as inhumane, telling the commons that they were rushing into that very cruelty they themselves had condemned in others, and counseling them to say nothing about the decemvirs, but to be satisfied to regain their own power and authority, since thus the way would be open to them for obtaining every redress. Here we see plainly how foolish and unwise it is to ask a thing, and with the same breath say, "I desire this, that I may inflict an injury." For we should never declare our intention beforehand, but watch for every opportunity to carry it out, so that it is enough to ask another for his weapons, without adding, "With these I propose to destroy you." For once you have secured his weapons, you can use them afterwards as you please. Chapter 45. It is of evil example, especially in the maker of a law, to not observe the law when made, and that daily to renew acts of injustice in a city is most hurtful to the governor. Terms having been adjusted, and the old order of things restored in Rome, Virginius cited Appius to defend himself before the people, and, on appearing attended by many of the nobles, ordered him to be led to prison. Whereupon Appius began to cry out and appeal to the people, but Virginius told him that he was unworthy to be allowed that appeal which he had himself done away with, or to have that people who he had wronged for his protectors. Appius rejoined that the people should not set at naught that right of appeal, which they had themselves insisted on with so much zeal. Nevertheless, he was dragged to prison, and before the day of trial slew himself. Now, Though the wicked life of Appius merited every punishment, still it was impolitic to violate the laws, more particularly a law that had only just been passed, for nothing, I think, is of worse example in a republic than to make a law and not to keep it, and most of all when he who breaks is he that made it. After the year 1494, the city of Florence reformed its government with the help of the friar Girolamo Savonarola, whose writings declare his learning, his wisdom, and the excellence of his heart. Among other ordinances for the safety of the citizens, he caused a law to be passed allowing an appeal to the people from the sentences pronounced by the Eight and by the Signory in trials for state offenses, a law he had long contended for and carried at last with great difficulty. It so happened that very shortly after it was passed, 5 citizens were condemned to death by the Signory for state offenses, and that when they sought to appeal to the people, they were not permitted to do so, and the law was violated. This, more than any other mishanch, lessened the credit of the friar, since if his law of appeal was salutary, he should have caused it to be observed; if useless, he ought not to have promoted it. And his inconsistency was more remarked because in all the sermons which he preached after the law was broken, he neither blamed nor excused the person who had broken it, as though unwilling to condemn while unable to justify what suited his purposes. This, as betraying the ambitious and partial turn of his mind, took from his reputation and exposed him to much obloquy. Another thing which greatly hurts a government is to keep alive bitter feelings in men's minds by often renewed attacks on individuals, as was done in Rome after the Decemvirate was put an end to. For each of the decemvirs and other citizens besides were at different times accused and condemned, so that the greatest alarm was spread through the whole body of the nobles, who came to believe that these prosecutions would never cease until their entire order was exterminated. And this must have led to grave mischief, had not Marcus Duilius, the tribune, provided against it by an edict that forbade everyone, for the period of 1 year, citing or accusing any Roman citizen, an ordinance which had the effect of reassuring the entire nobility. Here we see how hurtful it is for a prince or commonwealth to keep the minds of their subjects in constant alarm and suspense by continually renewed punishments and violence. And in truth, no course can be more pernicious. For men who are in fear for their safety will seize on every opportunity for securing themselves against the dangers that surround them, and will grow at once more daring and less scrupulous in resorting to new courses. For these reasons, we should either altogether avoid inflicting injury, or should inflict every injury at a stroke, and then seek to reassure men's minds and suffer them to settle down and rest.
Thank you for listening to Discourses on Livy by Niccolò Machiavelli, here on Noctis, Inkborne. I hope this journey through the ideas, history, and political reflections of Machiavelli has brought you clarity, curiosity, and a deeper appreciation of his work. This concludes Part 2 of the audiobook. The exploration doesn't end here. Part 3 is currently in preparation and will be released soon. It will continue the remaining chapters and bring you closer to the full depth of Machiavelli's insights. If you're enjoying this series, consider staying connected to Noctis Inkborne for upcoming releases, timeless classics, and more immersive narrations. Until then, thank you for listening, and see you soon in Part 3.